Mormons of the LDS variety no longer practice polygamy, but they will still defend it tooth and nail. It's in their history, it's in their doctrine, and so much of it was just plain wrong. But it's not easy admitting it was wrong when your people invested so much in it to the point in delaying statehood for Utah for decades in defense of polygamy. So in their quest to defend the indefensible, you'll hear all sorts of untruths as to why polygamy was such a big deal in 19th century Mormonism, why it was good even. Let's talk about those untruths. Starting with one of the most common you'll hear, polygamy was meant as a way of taking care of pioneer widows or other women who didn't have a big strong man to take care of them. Okay, that was rarely, if ever, a reason for polygamous marriages. I mean, look at this ancestor of mine who raised her family across the river from Nauvoo until her husband died, at which point she took their 6 children with the wagon and ox team across the plains to Utah without a big bigamous man taking care of them. Another example is Heber C. Kimball, one of the most famous Mormon polygamists. Heber was poor, but even still he was frequently away serving missions for the church. He couldn't financially support living polygamy, and yet he had 37 wives and 65 children, and they had it rough. Untruth number 2. Mormon women fought for polygamy, which is true, because they loved polygamy, which is not true. What they loved, or feared, depending on perspective, was their faith. Some Mormon women were very vocal in coming to the defense of polygamy during the time when most of the rest of the country was united in trying to put an end to it. But if you read their defenses, it's reminiscent of today's arguments defending the church's homophobia. They did it because they thought God wanted them to. It was all about faithful obedience, since it was a requirement for their exaltation. They did come up with other more practical defenses of polygamy, but they frankly fall apart with scrutiny, but then again, many things related to faith do. However, when you dig into the details of these women's lives or read their journals, living polygamy sucked. My great-grandma, for example, was 17 when her dad died of old age at age 77. She was glad to have him gone because she didn't know the guy, and yet he acted like he had authority over her the few times he was around. So she and her half-sister, best friend, rubbed onions in their eyes at his funeral because they were expected to look sad at the passing of their own father. Now the city of Layton, Utah is named after the guy, and don't think her mom was any more fond of him. She was 18 when she became his 7th wife, 6th living, when he was 41. When he ran away from federal authorities who were arresting polygamists, he asked her to follow him, and she turned him down. She preferred instead to raise the kids alone, run the farm alone, because living polygamy was just that good. Or there were these ancestors of mine who were happily raising a family together in England when they joined the church, left their families, crossed an ocean together, crossed a continent together, all to join the saints in Utah, after which he married 2 more women and more or less abandoned her. He and his youngest wife moved up to settle the tiny town of Croydon, Utah, while she stayed behind in Salt Lake City, where she grew old and died, all while he was raising another whole family without her up in Croydon. Now for one of the biggest untruths that you'll hear, that the real purpose for polygamy is for the Lord to raise up seed, or for you to have more children than you would have otherwise. This justification is even enshrined in Mormon scripture, but mathematically it's 100% false. It does the exact opposite. I mean, just look at the most famous Mormon polygamist, Brigham Young. He had 56 wives, and by 1902 he had more than 1,000 direct descendants. Out of those 56 wives, he had children through just 16 of them, for a grand total of 57 kids. That was an average of 3.5 kids per woman. But the fertility rate at the time in the US was 5 kids per woman. And remember, that's not even counting any of the 40 wives who he didn't have any children with. It's hard to have more kids when your resources are spread so incredibly thin. There's also Heber C. Kimball, who I already mentioned is famous for polygamy. He's also famous for his wives leaving him. But he had 65 children through 17 of his wives. But that's still less than 4 kids per woman. Again, not even counting the wives he didn't have any children with. Contrast that with this ancestor of mine who had 12 children because they didn't have to spread their resources so thin. Imagine how many children each of Brigham Young's or Heber C. Kimball's wives would have had if they had instead had a monogamous husband who they didn't have to share. Which reminds me of another untruth, that polygamy was necessary also because there were more righteous women than men. Again, not true. Have you ever noticed that the age gap between husband and wife tended to widen with each successive wife? One of the most egregious examples was the prophet Lorenzo Snow. He married his last polygamous wife when he was 57 and she was 15. And she was well known as being his favorite. Imagine that. He took his Minnie everywhere with him. Do you really think that Minnie couldn't have found a young man she could have married? You bet she could have, but could Lorenzo have found another 57-year-old woman to marry? No, they'd all been married already for decades. Just like him, actually. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not against polygamy itself. Polygamy has its advantages, it really does. But so does monogamy, and gay marriage, and polyandry, and just being single for that matter. What's wrong with any of those is when you mandate it legally or make it necessary for one's salvation. That's when you get abuse. That's when you get miserable people who are making choices that are not good for them, that they would not have chosen otherwise. All right, I'll get off my soapbox. Carry on.